Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sigh. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus.
I can switch, I think, at least temporarily over here so I can pay attention to what's going on. So we're finishing up Noah's story. Actually, in truth, we get to Abraham by the end of this chapter, which is the next block 4. But he's actually the end of the discussion of the descendants of Shem. So we're going to block that part of the discussion about Abraham in with Noah's story. Verse 10 of chapter 11 says, "These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood." All right. Anybody remember what Genesis 5:32 told us? Don't everyone raise your hand at the same time.
And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Okay, first things first, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were not triplets. So that's not a statement of absolute that Noah turned 500 years old and then those 3 boys were born. We want to get that out of the way. But we do have a time marker that lets us know that Noah was 500 when his son was born. Genesis 7 and verse 6. Anybody remember what Genesis 7 and 6 tells us?
Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth.
All right, so the flood came 100 years later. All right. By the way, how long did Noah prepare the ark? 120 years. So he actually started building the ark before he even had children. Interesting piece of information that a lot of people never really think about.
If you do the math from chapter 11 and verse 10.
Well, that's what we're getting to. Yep, we're getting to the math. The flood chronology that we went over, and we broke this down through chapters 7 and 8. This was the chart for it all. The important piece of information is the total flood event, 377 days, which is 12 months and 17 days, or a little over a year. All right? So there's 100 years between when Noah became a father and the flood started. Then there's 1.1 years of the flood. I want to throw one more passage in here. I can send it to you. I want to send one more stick one more passage in here, just some important information. Genesis 9:24. Anybody remember what we were taught in Genesis 9:24? I wouldn't if I hadn't looked it up. So, his youngest son, what his youngest son had done to him. Who was the son that acted in Genesis 9 in the incident with Noah? Ham. So we know that Ham's the youngest. Okay? That piece of information we know. Do we know what year Ham was born? No. Do we know how old Noah was when Ham was born? No. We know that he was born sometime before the flood. That's what we know. Ham's the youngest. So that leaves us Shem and Japheth in terms of which is the older of the sons of Noah. Genesis 11:10, we are told this was 2 years after the flood, and we are told how old Shem is. He's 100. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So if you do the math, 500 to 600 years in Noah's life is 100 years, 1.1 year for the flood. 2 years after the flood, we get 103.1. If Shem had been born when Noah was 500, he would be 103.1 years old, 2 years after the flood, not 100 years old. So there's a math issue. All right, we want to look at one more verse, Genesis 10 and verse 21. Somebody read that for me. Because this is the one that really makes things difficult. Yeah, Genesis 10:21. Okay, the older brother of Japheth. If we take that as is translated in, what translation you're reading from? The New English Translation. It's also translated that way in the New American Standard Bible. It's translated that way in the ESV. It's translated that way in the New King James. Is that correct? That Shem is the oldest brother of Japheth. Or the older brother of Japheth. Genesis 10:21.
And children were born to Shem, the father of all children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder.
Let's see. Okay, so the New King James is very vague. Who's the elder? And then when you look at the New International Version, sons were born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. And then they have a footnote rendering that says, or it could be Shem, the older brother of Japheth. And so here's what I want us to understand. That language right there is difficult to translate. Whether Genesis 10:21 is saying Shem is older or Japheth is older, they can't even agree upon in the translation process. The American Standard Version also puts this language of whose older brother was Japheth, or Japheth the elder, as a marginal or footnote rendering. So what we need to understand from all of this is a couple of different things. There's two possibilities that seem reasonable to me. And the reason we want to talk about this is because it's this kind of stuff that people attack the Bible for being inconsistent. Okay, this is a conflict in the text, is what people would say. It's hard to figure out. And so what do most of us do when we talk about the Bible? And there are these passages, and we get confronted with something like this and go, wait a minute, the math isn't working out. What do? Let's be honest. We observe the Passover. We just go, whoop, we're not going to talk about that. That is not a good thing to do. It's not a healthy thing to do at all. First, we're terribly equipped to deal with it when someone brings it up to us as a challenge to the accuracy of the Scriptures. We're just not equipped to deal with it at all. And that's not healthy. Secondly, just because something is hard to reconcile and understand doesn't mean it can't be understood. And so there are a couple of possibilities. I want to start all of this by saying that numbers, as in numerical statements in Hebrew, are very difficult. And almost all of the problems in translation in the Old Testament center around doing math and going, wait a minute, if this is right and this number doesn't match and these numbers don't work together, that's because of the nature of translating from ancient Hebrew, particularly the nature of translating numerical words. Secondly, if we take the way that many translations translate Genesis 10:21 and make Shem the older brother of Japheth, then you have serious math problems. Except for this. Anybody want to guess how much 3 years of 500 years is? You realize 500 years, that's half a millennia. Noah's been alive 500 years. And 3 years is 0.6% of 500 years, if my math was correct. And you know what 0.6 of 1 year is? A little less than 2 days. So it's like the difference between saying I'm 80 and I'm 80 years old and almost 2 days. Or I'm 100 or I'm 100 years and 3 days. Or something like that. It's not a significant amount of time. So what it says is, after Noah was 500, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That isn't necessarily a hard year. He may have been 503 when his oldest one was born. And Shem was the oldest. Or Japheth may, in fact, be the oldest. So it could be Japheth, Shem, and Ham. That could be the order. Or Noah was 503 years old when Shem was born, and Shem is actually the oldest. And then Japheth was born, and then Ham last. But it's not that big a... 3 years sounds like a big discrepancy to us. But when you're talking about 500 years, 3 years is not that big a deal. And the language in Genesis 5:32 is not absolute language. It's vague language. It's at some point after he had been alive for 500 years, he became the father of 3 children that clearly were not born at the same time. So they weren't all born when he was 500 years old. And I'm not even sure that 500 is a hard and fast year. It was after he had lived 500 years, that's when he started having children. So it doesn't really create a problem. But what it does do is leave us without knowing which one is the oldest. The only piece of information we know for certain is what? That Ham is the youngest. Now, if we take what is generally done And they list these sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, many, many, many times. If we take what's generally done, then you assume that Shem's the oldest. But the problem with that is chapter 10 begins the discussion of the descendants of Noah with who? Now, these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Sons were born to them. The sons of Japheth were, which would indicate that Japheth is the oldest, since how he's the first one that is addressed there. I think that Shem is listed as the first one when it lists the sons of Noah, primarily because Shem is the son of the lineage that brings the Messiah into the world. That's the one he's trying to draw focus on most of the time. I'm not sure what order they're born in. I'm not sure it matters what order they're born in. But I do want us to be aware of this issue so that if someone comes up and says, hey, the Bible's full of conflicts, and you go, no, there's not any conflicts in the Bible, and they go, well, this says that Noah was 500 years old, and this says that 2 years after the flood, he was 100 years old. Now, how is that possible? And there's a couple of different explanations that make it possible. What I know is that if he was 100 years old 2 years after the flood, then Noah was 503 when Shem was born. Whether that was his oldest son and he was 503 when he started having children, or whether Japheth was born when he was 500, Shem was born when he was 503, and then Ham was born at some point shortly after that, I don't know. But it's not really a problem. Because the point of Genesis 5:32, the point of Genesis 7, the point of these was not to put a hard and fast record of how old these individuals were. It was to mark time in the arc of the story, and to give us some sense of when these events took place and how long it took for them to take place and all that kind of stuff. What we're dealing with in chapter 10, as we talked about at length last week, is how we got all these nations, how they got scattered all over the world, how we got all the different languages that we have from three brothers who presumably all spoke the same language. And then we get introduced in chapter 11 to how that dispersion came to be and how the languages came to be. And ultimately, the answer to that question is, how did the distinction of languages among men come into being? Who caused it to happen? God. It was what God did to humble mankind. Because what man had begun to do was what man wanted to do instead of what God had asked them to do. And they decided that instead of being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth, they were going to build a city and stay right there and not be dispersed. And God said, you know, the way it is right now, pretty much anything they want to do, they're going to be successful at. And if that's the case, they're going to ignore me altogether. And so he confused their languages, and what that led to was the separation of people, and they eventually migrated to the various parts of the world. And then we see on the map that's up there right there what the basic breakdown was. This is North Africa, the green area there. This is the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East, and this up here is, you can see the boot of Italy up there pretty clearly. That's Europe. And then going to the right of the screen, if you keep going off there, you get into Russia and in those areas. And so that's the part of the world that this is. They began to disperse there, and they moved throughout the world, and we developed nations and ethnicities and the various things that we see in the world. Now, the focus in verse 10 and following, where we're actually at tonight, is on the descendants of Shem. Those are the ones that matter. Why do those? Now see, he already talked about the sons of Shem back in chapter 10 in verse 21, right? So why does he bring up the descendants of Shem again? Why does Shem's sons get talked about twice? That's exactly right. This one is not about the nations that arose from Shem. This one is about the story of how he was fulfilling the promise that he made back in Genesis 3 when he told the serpent that the seed of woman, Eve was the mother of all the living. Jesus was among the living, and so he was a descendant of Eve. After the flood, we're told that the 3 sons of Noah were the progenitors of all the peoples of the earth. This text is saying, okay, now it's Shem that's important to our story. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old. He became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arpachshad. He had other sons and daughters. And Arpachshad lived 35 years and became the father of Shelah. And Arpachshad lived 403 years after he became the father of Shelah, and he had other sons and daughters. Shelah lived 30 years, and he became the father of Eber. And Shelah lived 403 years after he became the father of Eber, and he had other sons and daughters. And Eber lived 34 years and became the father of Peleg. And we're not going to read all of this. I'm going to trust that y'all read through the lineage. Where we're going to is verses 24, 25, and 26. Nahor lived 29 years, became the father of Terah. That's a name that we ought to recognize. Nahor lived 119 years after he became the father of Terah, and he had other sons and daughters. And Terah lived 75 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Who's the important one in that list? Abram. Why is Abram important? Because promise number 2 gets made to Abraham. Promise number 1 was made to the serpent about the descendant of Eve. Promise number 2 is made to Abraham that from his seed all nations would be blessed. And so all of that from verse 10 to verse 26 is to get us from Noah to Abraham. So we understand the connection. And you can do the math and count the years if you want to and decide that that's exactly how many years it took and make your chronology and decide how old the earth is all you want to. I don't care. That's not the point. You know what the point is? This is how Abram came into the mix. That's why it says he begot this person and had other sons and daughters. And he begot this person and had... Why don't we get the names of all the other sons and daughters? I mean, I would feel kind of slighted. My brother got named, but I didn't get named. Why do we only have the names that we have?
That's so you can look at those New Testament genealogies and say, oh, yeah.
This is the genealogy of Christ. That's why these people matter. That's what this is about. It is telling us how God fulfilled his promise. And it covered a lot of years in just a few verses. These are the records of the generations of Terah. Now, he's already told us who the 3 sons of Terah are, but he backs up and says, okay, now Terah is the next one that's going to be a point of focus. Verse 27 is structured just like verse 10, right? Of Noah's 3 sons, you need to know about Shem. Now you need to know about Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. Now, why do we have Abram's brother's son mentioned here? Because he becomes an important character as well, right? In fact, who does he hang out with through his adult life? His uncle. He went with his uncle when his uncle left. So he's named. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Isaac. I'll get it out in a minute. Iscah. And Sarai was barren, and she had no child. Now, that's not just stuck there for fun either. Why are we told that information? Now, we don't know this yet, but we all know it, so I've already brought it up. Abraham's going to get a promise from God, right? What's that promise? Okay, through your seed all nations will be blessed. But not only that, there's another promise that he gets. Anybody remember what the other promise was? He told him to look up into the sky. And he said, as soon as you find somebody who can count all those stars, you'll find somebody who can count all your descendants. But Sarai was barren. So how is that going to happen? We're told that. So when we get to that promise, what are we learning? Why are we given that piece of information? Because when we get to that promise, when God says it's through your seed, and when God says your descendants will number as many as the sand on the seashore or the stars in the heavens, what do we know because we're told Sarah is barren? The minute he makes those promises, what do we know? Who's at work to fulfill those promises? Who brings about the seed of Abraham that's going to bless all nations? God. It lets us know that God, in his providence, was working to fulfill his promise. It didn't matter that Sarai was barren. What's impossible for God? It would be impossible for us, right? But it's not impossible for God. And so it's an important piece of information. Terah took Abraham, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. By the way, I would suggest to you that it became Haran when Haran and his descendants began to live there. You notice that was one of the names. Lot's father's name was what? Haran. And so the land of Haran was named because the descendants of Haran started living there, had settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, another piece of interesting information here. What do we know generally is starting to happen with the length of days that people are living? They are starting to decrease. People are not waiting as long to start having children, and they're not living as long. There is a connection. And so we need to just kind of notice that. Why don't people live to be 900 years old anymore? And it's kind of interesting. If you follow the arc that's put in the scriptures, they lived a long time in the beginning and it started trailing off, and then the flood happened, and then they boosted their years again for a while, and then it starts trailing off again. And by the time David is alive and is being inspired by God to write, he writes the Psalms and says how long the lifespan of man is what? About 70 to 80 years. Anybody want to guess what the lifespan of man is today? About 70 to 80 years. Are there some people who live a little longer? Yes, and there's a whole lot of people who don't live that long. And when you average it all out, guess what you get? About 70 to 80 years. You think maybe that's because that's what God wants. And so we see these things being played out, and we see that it is natural. What we're doing here, by the way, is we're learning that there was a reason why God gave them long life. And there's a reason why we don't see people today that are 500 years old when they start having children and then live for several hundred years longer after that. We don't see that. You ever met anybody that was 900 years old? So when you read the story of Methuselah, who lived to be 962, and you go, wow, that's kind of fanciful. No one lives that long. You actually know that, well, at that time, that wasn't all that unusual. And that we see the record of it getting smaller and smaller, and then you can just kind of reason from there as to why that would be the case. But we're not left just reading this and being left going, well, you know, if it's talking about 900-year-old people, that's got to be a fantasy. No, there's a progression over the course of many generations that went from 900-year-old people to 80-year-old people as being the lifespan. And we see the record of it. Now, it's not really about Terah, but we're told about Terah, so we learn about the lands. We learn about Canaan. We learn about Haran. We learn about these nations and where they got their names from, because they come into the story of the Christ and what God did to bring the Christ into the world later on through the Old Testament, right? We start reading about those lands and those peoples again. Who are the Canaanites? They're descendants of Canaan. Who are the Hittites? They're descendants of Hitt. Who are the, I don't know, what would you call them, the Harites? The descendants of Haran. The Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your country. This is chapter 12. I guess I need to jump up into this because we're now officially into the fourth block of our study, Abraham's story. This is where it starts, Genesis 12 in verse 1. Now Abraham's the focus. The Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great. How is he going to make him a great nation? His wife is barren. So you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. How is he going to be made into a great nation? Interestingly enough, he actually has two great nations that arise out of his loins by the time the story's over. We were told back in verse 30, and Sarai was barren, to make us go, well, wait a minute, how is that going to happen if his wife is barren? And that ought to foreshadow the conflict that we're going to be reading about, right? Because what is the big test in Abraham's life? Okay, well, the first big test is created right here, right? When God says what? Leave your family and your relatives and your land and go somewhere else. And Hebrews 11 points out that at the point that he left, had God told him where to go yet? No, he left not knowing where he was going. So there's the first big test. Is he going to listen to me? All right, Abraham, this is what you need to do. You need to leave all your family behind. You need to take your wife and you need to go, and I'm going to take the two of y'all and make a great nation. And Abraham says, but she's barren. Does he believe God? Anybody have an answer to that question? He actually did right here. That's the whole point of Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham went. He did believe God. He didn't know how it was going to happen. He didn't know where he didn't have any of the details. But he believed if he went, that God would do what he said. So Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. Verse 4. And Lot went with him. That's why Lot's mentioned by name earlier. Because Lot starts playing a role because Lot chooses to go with it. Who is Abraham following? God. So who is Lot following? Abraham. What does that mean? Well, I'll just kind of remind you of something that Paul wrote at one point when he said to the people that he was writing to, follow me as I follow Christ. That is who what Lot's doing. Lot sees the faith of Abraham and says, I'm going with him. And so Lot, we find out, is a man who is influenced by the faith of Abraham and develops faith for himself. Because he goes as well. Does Lot know where he's going? Nope. By the way, Lot hadn't received any promises yet either, had he? No promise about making a great nation out of him. No promise about anything. He's just going with Abraham because Abraham is following God and I'm going to go with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed. 75 years old. He has a barren wife and God says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Not trying to put you on the spot, Jeff. How old are you? How old are you? 76. He's 76. You're just about the same age Abraham was. Do you think you're going to have an offspring and have a great nation out of your loins at this point? I want you to understand the level of faith that it took for Abraham to leave. Because a 75-year-old man with a barren wife has no expectation of offspring being born. By the way, we've already been told. Go back. I told you that there's kind of some reason for some of this information. Shem lived 500 years and became the father. Okay, there's a long time before he became a father, right? Arpachshad lived 403 years and then he became a father. Selah lived 30 years and became a father. Eber lived 34 years and became a father. Peleg lived 30 years and became a father. Reu lived 32 years and became a father. Serug lived 30 years and became a father. Nahor lived 29 years and became a... What are we finding out about the ages of people having children? They're getting earlier and earlier and earlier, and guess what? Abraham, 75 years old, how many kids does he have? None. And he has a barren wife.
As a matter of fact, later on we find out the statement was made, she's well beyond the years of bearing children.
So we have to understand that this is a key that Abraham believed that nothing was impossible with God. If God said something, he believed God, and he built his life on that. no matter how improbable life would suggest that it is. And what we see in this story is God fulfills his promises. But boy, didn't it take a long time. He lit out when he was 75. Let's jump ahead just a little bit. I know I'm out of time, but let's jump ahead just a little bit. How old was he when the promised child was born? 125 years more he had to wait. And there's a little bump in the road along the way, right? Where he lost his patience. Where he grew weary of well-doing. Just like the rest of us have those bumps in the road where we lose our patience. We're not willing to wait for God. All right, got to stop. We'll pick this up next time, Lord willing. For the record, if he hadn't stopped the thing yet, we are stopping at verse 4 of chapter 12. And that's where I will pick up if the Lord wills.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all